This is LSAT Prep Test 153, Section 4, Passage 1, about forests and whether popular arguments for saving them actually hold up. This is a medium difficulty passage. Not really a hard read, but the author's real position is kind of slippery, and so most students end up landing in the wrong spot. Now, this is a science policy passage. The author is evaluating arguments, not making one big claim, and that distinction matters here. You're not tracking a thesis here, you are tracking a scorecard. The author is looking at two common arguments for forest preservation and then grades each one differently. Now, paragraph 1 is a setup with a bait and switch buried inside. The opening lines are pretty generous, talking about how forests are valuable. They provide economic products, recreation, flood control, and erosion prevention. All of those benefits are acknowledged. They're not questioning any of them. But then they pivot. The author says policymakers need a comprehensive understanding of the arguments, and two claims deserve special scrutiny. You want to read that phrase carefully because it sounds neutral and it's not. Every time this author scrutinizes something, it comes out looking worse. And so paragraph 1 tells you, I respect forests, but I don't respect sloppy reasoning about forests. And that is the whole passage in miniature. Then paragraph 2 is more of a clean kill, the lungs of the earth claim. The author calls it largely a myth. Now, on the LSAT, authors almost never use language that strong. So when you see it, lock it in. The reasoning here is dead simple. Trees make oxygen while they're alive. Decomposition eats it back when they die. The net effect is zero. You don't want to overthink this paragraph. The author's verdict here is obvious. Take it and move on. Now you want to slow way down for paragraph number 3. This is the paragraph that decides whether you get the hard questions right. It is about biodiversity, and the author handles it completely differently from the oxygen claim. There is no myth language here. There is no dismissal. Instead, you get two separate reasons why biodiversity might matter. First is the practical angle, that undiscovered rainforest plants could lead to new medicines. Second, you've got the moral angle. Preserving species is an intrinsic good, meaning it's worth doing even if it doesn't benefit us directly. Now, here is what makes this paragraph tricky. The author does not fully endorse either reason, but they don't reject them either. Look at the structure here. Even if one does not think the practical argument works, there is still the moral one. So the author is stacking up fallback positions. That's not how you talk about something that's nonsense. Compare that to paragraph 2, where the author says it's just a myth. The biodiversity argument gets respect, the oxygen argument gets shut down. Now, paragraph 4 does something that students usually miss. It concedes that biodiversity matters, and then argues the threat is overblown. That deforestation rates are exaggerated. Commercial plantations have fewer species, yes, but they take pressure off of natural forests. And the activists overstate how much land plantations cover. The real number is 3%, and so paragraph 4 isn't saying biodiversity doesn't matter. It's saying, calm down, the sky is not falling, it's not the end of the world here. Now, the key move is that the author gives you two arguments with completely different grades. The oxygen claim fails. The biodiversity claim passes, but with a note that says the situation is less urgent than reported. If you flatten those two verdicts into one, you're gonna pick the wrong answer on the main point question. Now, this passage is not about whether forests should be saved. It's about whether the reasons people give for saving them are any good. The author's actual stance is that forests are valuable, the oxygen argument is garbage, and the biodiversity argument has merit, but the crisis is overstated. That is a position with layers, and the test will punish you for simplifying it. Now, most students go wrong in one of two directions. Some think the author is anti-preservation because of the myth-busting. Others think the author fully supports preservation because of the warm opening they give it. Both of them miss the middle ground. The author wants better arguments and better data, not fewer forests. Now, before you hit the questions, make sure you know these three things. First, why does the author demolish the oxygen claim but leave the biodiversity claim standing? Second, what is the author's attitude toward commercial plantations? Are they a threat or are they a relief valve? And third, when the author cites the 3% figure at the end, whose claim is being undercut? So that was passage 1. We're going to go on to passage 2, same practice test. This is LSAT Prep Test 153, Section 4, Passage 2, about native language preservation through radio. This is a low difficulty passage. The structure is clean and the author's position is obvious, almost too obvious, and that's actually the problem. Students read this, they feel comfortable, then they pick choices that are close but not quite right. Now, this is a social science passage. The author thinks radio can help save indigenous languages, but only if the programming is done in a specific way. If you leave out that condition, you've missed the point. Now, paragraph 1 is background. You want to move through it fast. Languages are dying, government policies made it worse, but recently, things are turning around with universities, recordings, and radio stations. That word yet in the middle of the paragraph is your signal. Everything before it is decline. Everything after it is pushback. You don't have to memorize any of the details here. Just know the author is setting up a problem and response structure. That's all paragraph 1 is doing. Paragraph 2 makes the case for radio specifically. The author is not just listing radio along with other tools anymore, and now radio is getting its own argument. Why? Because indigenous cultures have strong oral traditions and radio fits that. It is a spoken medium for a spoken culture. The paragraph also brings in a community angle. Older speakers reconnecting with their languages, younger people learning idiomatic usage. Two things happening here. Radio works because of the format, and radio works because of what it does to the community. You want to hold on to both of those. Then paragraph 3 is where you slow way down. The internet shows up and it's a threat. Not because the internet's bad in some general sense, it's a threat because it usually means using English. And so the more time people spend online, the more English crowds out the native language. Radio could push back against that. But here's the part most students blow past. The author doesn't say radio will push back past it. The author says radio programming has to resonate with the living oral traditions to actually work. And that phrase is doing all the heavy lifting here. It is a condition. If you strip it out, the passage is just saying radio is good. Leave it in, and the passage becomes radio's good, but only if you do it right. Every hard question on this passage comes back to that distinction. Now, paragraph 4 shows you what doing it right looks like in practice. An analyst compares two situations. In communities where the native language is still dominant, the radio programming is natural and rich. You've got elders speaking, word games, speeches, and songs. But in communities where English has already taken over, the programming turns into stiff language lessons that are disconnected from culture. The author clearly thinks the first approach is the one that works. So this paragraph is not making a new argument, it's proving the claim from paragraph 3. The details here about elders, word games, and songs are all just examples, they're not the point. You don't want to get stuck cataloging them, you want to know why they're there. Now the key move is that conditional. Radio is only effective when the programming connects to living oral traditions. If you take away the condition, you have a different passage and you're going to choose a wrong answer. The author, of course, supports radio. That part's pretty easy. The trap is picking an answer that states that support too broadly. If a choice says the author believes radio is an effective tool for language preservation full stop, it's probably wrong. The right answer will include the qualifier. It'll say something about the kind of programming that matters. You want to watch out for that on main point questions and on any questions about the author's attitude. Now, one more thing. Students sometimes read paragraph 3 as being anti-internet, but it's not. The author is not attacking the internet. The author is saying the internet creates a pressure and radio needs to respond to that pressure in a specific way. That is a softer claim than saying the internet is harmful. So if you see a choice that frames the author as being hostile to the internet, you want to be skeptical of that. Now, before you hit the questions, check yourself on 3 things. First, what condition does the author place on radio's effectiveness? Second, why does the analyst comparison in paragraph 4 matter to the argument? And third, what is the difference between how the author treats the internet and how a careless reader might describe it? So that was passage 2. We're going to go on to passage 3 now. And by the way, you can access all of these practice tests inside your LSAC Law Hub account. I cannot display them on screen due to copyright. We don't want to get sued or shut down, unfortunately, and so LSAC is the best place to access these. Now, this is LSAT PrepTest 153, Section 4, Passage 3. This is a comparative or dual passage. The topic is judicial sincerity, whether judges have a duty to actually believe what they write in their opinions. Medium difficulty passage set here. And the reason this is tricky has nothing to do with the subject. It's tricky because both passages are on the same side. They both defend honesty. And so your brain wants to lump them together, but the test, of course, won't let you. Passage A, paragraph 1 is pure setup. Some legal theorists say requiring judges to be sincere is naive. They think judges have too many competing pressures to worry about honesty. Now, you don't need to memorize the reasoning. You've just got to know this camp exists because the rest of the passage is a response to it. Now, paragraph 2 gives the first defense of sincerity. This is the prudential case. Now, prudential just means practical. The argument goes, honesty produces better results. It helps lower courts follow decisions. It makes the judiciary look legitimate. You want to read this paragraph at normal speed, but don't anchor here. The author is about to undercut it. Now, paragraph 3 is the most important paragraph in passage A. This is where the author steps in and says the practical defense has a hole in it. Not that it's wrong, that it's not enough. The problem is it treats honesty like a tool. If honesty stops producing good outcomes, the practical argument gives you no reason to keep being honest. The author says that's backward. Truth-telling is a moral duty. It stands on its own. It doesn't need to prove it's useful. And that word independent is the one to catch. It tells you the author wants to separate the moral case from the practical one entirely. And so passage A structure is, here's the opposition, here's one defense, that defense is incomplete, we need a deeper one grounded in morality. Now passage B. And here's where you've got to slow down, because passage B sounds like it might go in the same direction, but it doesn't. Passage B's opening paragraph says judges need to give real reasons for their decisions, not fake ones, because the whole system of checking judicial power depends on it. If judges can say one thing and believe another, then constitutions and precedents stop mattering. Nobody can hold a judge accountable for reasoning they never actually used. And people will notice. Public cynicism will go up. That's all practical, every single bit of it. Now, the last paragraph of passage B is where most students make their mistake. The author asks a direct question. Does all of this prove candor is an absolute obligation? And the answer is probably not. Read that again. Passage B concedes that its own argument doesn't shut the door on judicial deception entirely. It says sometimes deception might yield a net benefit, and these arguments alone don't fully rebut that. But, and this is where passage B lands, any honest cost-benefit analysis has to account for the massive institutional damage dishonesty causes. So the conclusion is a strong presumption in favor of candor, not an absolute rule, just a presumption. Now, the key move across both passages is this. Passage A says, practical arguments for sincerity are fundamentally incomplete. You've got to have moral principles to finish the job. Passage B builds the strongest practical case it can, admits it has limits, and says that's still good enough. And that is not a small difference. Passage A would look at passage B's argument and say, you just made the same mistake I warned about in paragraph 3. You're still treating honesty as something that has to justify itself through results. Passage B would shrug and say, the results are strong enough to carry the weight. Now, the passage level pattern here is a split in how far each author is willing to push the same basic position. They agree on the destination, but they disagree about what gets you there. Passage A wants a foundation that can't be eroded by a cost-benefit analysis. Passage B is fine living inside a cost-benefit analysis as long as the costs of dishonesty are weighted heavily. Now, the main trap in the questions will be choices that treat the two passages as being interchangeable, but they're not. Any answer that says that both authors rely on moral principles is wrong. Any answer that says passage B rejects practical reasoning is wrong. And any answer that says they disagree about whether judges should be honest is also wrong. The disagreement here is narrower than that. It's about the type of argument that best supports honesty. Now, you want to watch for a question You want to watch for a question about what passage A's author would say about passage B's conclusion. The answer will hinge on this. Passage A explicitly criticizes the kind of reasoning passage B relies on. Now, before you go to the questions, check yourself on three things. First, can you name the specific flaw passage A finds in the practical defense? 2, what exactly does passage B's author conclude? Not what you assume they conclude, but the actual landing point. And third, if both authors agree judges should be honest, what precisely do they disagree about? So that was passage 3. We're going on to passage 4. And by the way, folks, I'm doing my regular live Q&As today at 2 p.m. Eastern, 1 Central, 11 Pacific on YouTube, TikTok, IG. That'll be open Q&A. Anything at all, LSAT and law school admissions in about an hour and a half or so. This is LSAT PrepTest 153, Section 4, Passage 4. This is about the rise and fall of grand theories in historical thinking. It's a low difficulty passage. The structure is pretty straightforward, and the author's passage is pretty clearly stated. Now, this is a humanities passage. The author is arguing that grand theories like Marxism and Freudianism have failed, but that their failure creates an opportunity for a better kind of historical thinking. Now, the most important paragraph here is the last one, paragraph 3. That's where the author stops describing the problem and starts proposing a solution. If you don't track what that solution actually is, you're going to miss the main point. Now, paragraph 1 is pure setup. It defines grand theories and gives you 2 examples, Freudianism and Marxism. The key idea is historical determinism. That means the belief that history follows fixed universal laws. Everything in this paragraph is background. You want to read it at normal speed, but don't linger. You've got to understand what grand theories claim and then move on. Now, paragraph 2 is the takedown. It explains why grand theories lost their authority. 2 reasons. First, events happened that didn't fit the theories, and some theories got tied to political systems and failed. But notice the author's tone at the end of the paragraph. The author is not saying Freud and Marx were always wrong. The author is saying they were reasonable for their time, but turned out to be limited. That is a softer position than most students expect. If a question asks about the author's attitude toward Freud or Marx, don't pick anything that says the author thinks they were worthless. The author thinks they were products of their era, and that's different. Now, paragraph 3 is where the real argument lives. It starts with this idea of a nostalgia for determinism. People gave up grand theories, but they still want what grand theories gave them. That feeling that history makes sense. And so we're stuck. We don't believe the old explanations anymore, but we still want the comfort they provided us. And then the author does something specific. The author says this discomfort might actually be useful because it could push us toward a new kind of historical thinking. One that pays attention to the messy, unrepeatable details of events instead of forcing everything into one big pattern. The author even describes what this new approach could look like. Laws that constrain rather than necessitate. And that phrase is important. It means rules that limit what can happen without dictating exactly what must happen. That's the author's whole idea in a nutshell. So you want to slow down through the last half of paragraph 3. That's where the answer to the main point question is going to be. Now, the key move here is the shift from diagnosis to prescription. The author spends most of the passage explaining why grand theories failed, but the real point is not the failure, it's what should replace them. The main point is that we need a historical approach that explains events without treating them as inevitable. Now, the author is cautiously optimistic. They're not angry at grand theories, they're not mourning them. The author sees their decline as a chance to think better about history. Now, the main trap is thinking this passage is mainly about why grand theories are wrong, but it's not. The critique of grand theories is just the setup. The proposal for a new approach is the point. So if you walk away thinking this was just a takedown of Marxism and Freudianism, you're going to pick a main point answer that's too narrow. Now, before you hit the questions, check yourself on these 3 things. First, what does the author think should replace grand theories? Second, why does the author say our current discomfort might be a good thing? And third, what is the difference between laws that necessitate and laws that constrain? So that was passage 4. We're going to go on now to Prep Test 151, Section 1, Passage 1. This is LSAT Prep Test 151, Section 1, Passage 1. It is a law passage about the Shelley versus Kramer decision, medium difficulty passage. And this one's kind of sneaky because the author agrees with the court's result, but tears apart the reasoning. And if you don't catch that split, you're going to get the hardest questions wrong. Now, the main point is that Shelley versus Kramer was right to strike down racially restrictive covenants, but the legal logic it used was broken, and it didn't even go far enough. Paragraph 1 is just the opening. It tells you what restrictive covenants are, and it tells you the court struck them down. Then the author says the decision is justly celebrated. Now, that phrase matters later. You can read this paragraph at a pretty normal pace, but don't blow past the last two sentences. You've got the word however showing up, and that's where the real passage starts. Everything before however is background. Everything after it is the argument. If you're still summarizing when you cross that line, you want to shift gears. Now, paragraph 2 is the hardest paragraph. You want to slow way down here. That's where the author walks you through the court's reasoning step by step, and you've got to follow every link in the chain. Now, here's why it's tricky. The 14th Amendment only covers state actions. Covenants are private contracts, so there is no obvious state action to point to. So the court's solution was creative. It said that when a court enforces a private contract, that enforcement is state action. So the contract's terms get attributed to the state. And if the state couldn't pass those terms as a law, then a court cannot enforce them either. That is the logic. And it sounds clean, but it's not. But the author needs you to understand it before showing you why it breaks down. So don't skim this. Treat this like instructions you're going to be tested on, because of course you will in the questions. Now, paragraph 3 is where the author goes after that reasoning. And the most important paragraph is actually this one, not paragraph 2. Paragraph 2 builds up the reasoning. Paragraph 3 knocks it down. The author's first punch. If you take Shelley's logic and apply it consistently, the line between state action and private action disappears. Every private contract could end up in court. So every private contract would have to meet constitutional standards. And that is, of course, unworkable. And the author doesn't say it's unworkable in theory. Courts proved it, and they never applied Shelley's approach. Again, that is a big deal. The Supreme Court's own reasoning was so flawed that nobody, not the Supreme Court, not lower courts, ever actually used it. And then comes the example. Courts enforce settlement agreements that restrict someone's speech all the time. If Shelley's logic held, those agreements would be unconstitutional too. A law limiting that same speech would violate the First Amendment. But nobody treats those contracts that way. So the example is proof that Shelley's rule collapsed the moment anybody tried to extend it. Then the author lands their second punch right at the end. The court called the covenants themselves perfectly legal. The author thinks that's the deeper failure. The problem wasn't that courts enforced these covenants. The problem was the covenants existed at all. Their content was unjust, and the court should have said so, but it didn't. Now, the key move here is that two-part critique. The reasoning was unworkable, and it also missed the real target. Those are separate problems, and the questions likely ask about each one of those differently. Now, the pattern running through this passage is a mismatch between surface and substance. The decision looks right, but reasons incorrectly. The covenants look like a private matter, but produce a public harm. The legal rule sounds logical, but falls apart in practice. Every layer has that same gap between how something appears and what's actually going on. Now, the trap is that most students will read this as an attack on the Shelley decision, but it is not. If you look back at that word justly in paragraph 1, you're going to see the author is not saying the court got it wrong. The author is saying the court got it right for the wrong reasons, and that's a more narrow claim. If you flatten that into saying the author opposes Shelley, you're going to miss the answer on attitude questions. And you'll also get pulled toward wrong answers that say the author thinks the 14th Amendment should not apply to housing discrimination. The author never says that either. Now, before you get to the questions, check yourself on these three things. First, can you explain why the court needed to find state action at all? Second, can you say what the author thinks the court should have attacked instead of enforcement? And third, can you explain what the speech example proves about Shelley's reasoning? So that was passage 1. We're going to go on to passage 2, and again, you can access all of these inside your LSAC Law Hub account. I can't display them on screen due to copyright, unfortunately. This is LSAT Prep Test 151, Section 1, Passage 2. This is about whether the bow tie people in Kazakhstan domesticated and rode horses 6,000 years ago. Difficulty is fairly low. It's pretty easy. The content is pretty accessible, but their reasoning here has a twist that catches students sometimes. Now, this is a science passage built around one archaeologist's detective work. Sandra Olson has a theory. The bow tie domesticated and rode horses, and she can't prove it directly. And so the whole passage is her eliminating alternatives until her theory is the last one standing. That is the engine driving everything here. Now, one thing to notice up front. This is a single long passage with no paragraph breaks. That means you don't get the usual visual cues telling you when the argument shifts. You've got to hear those shifts yourself, and there are 4 of them. I'm going to walk through each one. Now, the opening few sentences set the stage here. Olson, Kazakhstan, horse bones everywhere, 90% of all bones found. But then you hit the detail that makes the whole passage necessary. Domestic horse bones look identical to wild horse bones. You can't just eyeball them. And that one fact is the reason Olson has to go through all the indirect reasoning that follows. If you miss that, the rest of the passage feels like overkill. Now comes where you got to slow way down for it, where Olson looks at the sex and age data from the bones, and the logic does a full U-turn. She starts with a known pattern. Herders who raise animals for meat kill young males early and keep the females. That's how goat herding works, and there's archaeological evidence for it. So you would expect a domesticated herd to skew female with lots of juvenile male bones. But at the bow tie sites, males are mostly full-grown adults, and they slightly outnumber the females. So your gut reaction should be, okay, these were wild. Hunters went after big males for the meat, makes sense. Olson says no, and here's why. Wild horses don't roam around as individuals. They live in 2 kinds of groups. Family units, led by one stallion with several mares, and small bachelor pods of young males. When hunters attack, families stay together, and the bachelors scatter. And so if you're hunting for efficiency, you hit the family groups. And that means your kill pile should have way more females than males. The bow tie bones show the opposite. So what looked like evidence for hunting actually points away from it. You've got to see that reversal happening because the questions will, of course, ask about it. But there is still a problem with the domestication theory. If these were domestic herds, why weren't the younger males culled the way goat herders do it? Now, Olson's answer ties the whole argument together. If the bow tie were riding horses, they would need to keep males alive. Riding explains the one piece of the data that doesn't fit the standard domestication pattern. It's clean, one explanation covers the gap. And then the passage shifts to physical evidence. Whole skeletons with full spines, pelvises, and everything were found at the dwelling sites. These are 1,000-pound animals. Nobody is dragging a whole horse carcass home on foot. That only makes sense if they had other horses to help move them, and so the whole skeletons are evidence for domestication and for riding at the same time. Now, the final piece is the burials. Horse skeletons found arranged deliberately alongside human remains. That suggests a bond that goes beyond just killing horses for food. It is the emotional punctuation mark at the end of a logical argument. Now, the key move in this passage is the bone ratio reversal. What looks like evidence for hunting is actually evidence against it because of how wild horse groups behave. Now, every hard question for this passage will trace back to whether you follow that logic. And here's where students go wrong. Olson sounds confident, and the evidence is stacking up, so people walk away thinking she proved her case, but she did not. Look at the hedging language. What may be evidence? Probably domesticated. Perhaps some wild ones. She is building the strongest circumstantial case she can. But the passage never says the question is settled. And so if a choice says Olson established or proved domestication, it's too strong. If one says the evidence is too weak to draw any conclusions, it's too weak. She is in between, leaning toward domestication, presenting the best available case, not closing the book. Now, before you touch the questions, check yourself on these 3 things. First, Why does the high proportion of adult males actually hurt the hunting explanation instead of helping it? Second, what specific problem does the riding hypothesis solve that regular domestication doesn't? And third, what do the whole skeletons at the dwelling sites rule out, and what do they rule in? So that was passage 2. I'll be back in about an hour and a half for my daily live Q&A on anything at all, LSAT and law school admissions. If you find these helpful, please spread the word. The only way this grows is through word of mouth. I don't do any advertising for these lives. The algorithm doesn't really boost them because they can't run ads during them, so I do appreciate your support. I'm also offering free LSAT tutoring for everybody watching this now or later. The link to book that free tutoring lesson with me is unpluggedprep.com/start. The link is below the video on YouTube, pinned in the chat on YouTube, in my bio on TikTok and IG as well. See you all in a bit.